welcome to The Teaching Point. For today's episode, we have Dr. Dennis Kwek, who has a plethora of experience. He's from the National Institute of Education Office for Research. He covers Center Directors for Center of Research in Pedagogy and Practice, as well as he's Associate Dean for Strategic Engagement, Senior Research Scientist. So thank you, Dr. Kwek, for joining us today. Could you share with us a little bit more about yourself?
Okay, thanks for inviting me for this podcast. I am the Center Director for the Center for Research in Pedagogy and Practice, or CRPP for short. CRPP has been around since 2002, so it's one of the oldest education research centers around the world, actually, and definitely in Singapore. And the work that we do there is largely to really help our Singapore schools improve in terms of teaching and learning. And so a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the research that we do covers both descriptive studies of what's happening in schools as well as the kinds of innovations that we can help with teaching and learning. That's kind of some of the work that we do over there. My own personal research area is in classroom pedagogies. So I like to understand how the teachers teach, why do they teach the way they do, and how do students learn. And trying to shift the needle, if you like, in the way in which classroom practices work, especially with the introduction of new technologies, new demands, etc., and all that. So that's kind of like the nutshell of what I do in NIE.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. So I think learning about the teaching environments and learning environments of students especially for today's world and context is very important. So with that, given that today's episode really focuses on that, how would you describe the classroom experience of a typical primary 5 student in today's classroom?
That's a very good question. So let me give you a little bit of a history about my own research life in NIE. First, when I first joined NIE in 2004, I was a research associate with the Center for Research in Pedagogy and Practice, and I was hired in specifically to do to go into classrooms to look at what teachers are doing in classrooms. And this was the first time that a large study has been conducted in Singapore where we are going into hundreds of lessons to really collect information about the typically what's known as the black box. When the classroom doors close, we don't really know what happens inside the classroom. So that was the first time that we were invited to go into hundreds of lessons to really see what's happening in the classroom. And this study is known as the Core Research Program, and it began in 2003 and is still ongoing now. We often like to call it the hidden gem in NIE because we do a lot of work in it which influences our policy ideas and all that, but we are also trying to see how we can continue to change the way teaching and learning happens in our classrooms. So back in 2004, when I first entered into a classroom, say for example in science, so I'm in a science primary 5 classroom, and I would be in a number of schools. So in a week, for example, I'll be in 3 or 4 schools, watching 3 or 4 teachers or even 5 teachers, different lessons, but all on the same topic, for example. And you would almost certainly see the same thing being taught in all those lessons, and it would be the same way, the same textbook, the same pages. It's almost like a cookie cutter approach to how teaching and learning happens in those classrooms. And that was back in 2004. Okay. Now, almost 20 years later, more than 20 years later, if I were to go into a classroom now, and I've been watching a lot of videos of lessons, I can confidently say that that cookie cutter approach, where you see almost the same thing being taught to all the students, is now very, very different. The nature of teaching and learning is so varied now that if you were to go into the same topic in 5 different schools taught by 10 different teachers, they would all be different. The content or the outcomes might be the same, but the way the teachers teach, the kinds of interactions that happens, the kinds of talk that happens in the classroom, they're all different. So the first immediate thing that we can see, right, is 20 years of changes in terms of pedagogies that happens in the classroom. And it is quite a significant change. Teachers are now given a lot of autonomy and a lot of freedom in deciding what is it that they want to teach in response to the needs of their students.
Right.
Yeah.
So then how would you pick out then really the key points from the research or maybe for the black box itself? And what are the key base research points or the key based I would say conclusions that you think are important to highlight in the efforts that have been made within the past 20 years?
Okay. When we think about what happens in a classroom, we always look at three particular things. We look at the kinds of knowledge emphasis that the teachers make. We look at the kinds of interactions that happens in the classroom, and we look at the kinds of assessment practices that teachers do in the classroom. So in terms of knowledge, for example, the idea of moving around, say, factual knowledge, right? The delivery or the transmission of factual knowledge to emphasizing conceptual understanding, to emphasizing metacognitive understanding. So that's what knowledge is all about. The different kinds of knowledge that the teachers can bring into the classroom for the students to learn about. Okay. In 2004, the emphasis is very clearly on factual knowledge, on preparing students for the PSLE, which I think is the year after, right? Now, over the years, over 20 years, we begin to see that change or the shift away from factual knowledge. It's still important, but more time is spent on conceptual knowledge, for example, on making connections between different ideas, different concepts, making connections between what the students know in the classroom and what they know at home or in the environment in terms of science, for example. So all those kinds of conceptual connections are being made to help students better understand why this subject is important for them to learn. That's the needle that we see shifting across 20 years, that move towards deeper conceptual understanding, the move towards deeper metacognitive understanding, the move towards more self-directed learning that happens. That's in terms of knowledge. Interaction is also interesting as well, because back then, the teacher is the sage on the stage.
Yeah.
Right. So the environment in the classroom has not changed for probably 100 years, perhaps. You have four walls, you have tables, and you have chairs, and you have the teacher in front, right? But that's the nature of any kind of classroom, because you only have one person who's the adult or the expert, and the rest of them are trying to learn from this expert, right? That hasn't changed much.
Yes.
Okay, and we can't really change that much. What we can change is the nature of the talk that happens in the classroom. So the teacher in 2004, when we observed then, goes through what's known as a very traditional IRE format. The teacher initiates something, the student responds, and then the teacher evaluates that response, the IRE structure. And that is very common because that's a very fantastic and effective way in which teachers can check to make sure that the students understand something, right? Now, that still happens because that's a very, very fast and a very effective tool in the teacher's toolkits. That still happens now. But what we're beginning to see is a lot more pair and group work happening. So students get into pairs and they're exchanging ideas and they're brainstorming and they're talking to one another, whether it's in pairs or groups. We're also beginning to see teachers also using ideas such as dialogic teaching. So whole class discussions where the idea is that a teacher will ask a question, or typically an open question, and then the students would respond, and the teacher will ask, "That's a very good idea. What do you think about it?" and ask another student to respond to that. And then the idea gets moved around the classroom. It continues to build and change. A co-construction of knowledge between the teacher and the student. So the teacher is no longer telling the students what I know.
Yes.
The teacher is actually working through some of the students' understanding and misunderstandings and coming up with this is important for you to understand, right? Then when it comes to assessment, back in 2004, it is really just prepare for exam. Right? That was it, the teaching to the test kind of a mode. Now, we're seeing that move towards more formative forms of assessment for learning, where teachers are giving formative feedback to the students. Teachers are using different forms of assessment practices such as peer assessment, self-assessment, exit cards, etc. and all that. So the entire landscape from 2004 to now has changed quite a lot because of all these new tools that teachers have in their toolkits that they encourage the use in the classroom. We see that happening. We see that that is beneficial not just for the teachers in helping to teach ideas and knowledge to the students, but also for students to become more and more engaged in the classroom. And it is amazing nowadays when you go into the classroom, right? It's noisy because the students are enjoying it and they are very vocal. They are trying to understand what is it that the teacher is opening up for them to talk about in the classroom. Yeah, things are different and exciting for us because it's always now as a researcher when we go into the classroom, it's always a surprise for us to see what teachers can do. So yeah, things have changed.
I think that's interesting to see, but also I think from maybe personal experiences, you would see the students coming back saying that they have different variety of activities as compared to perhaps back then. Do you think that this is, or perhaps do you think that this provides a much more positive impact towards perhaps their assessment later on in life or as they grow older towards maybe their examinations in that sense of understanding concepts and perhaps understanding how subjects apply in real life applications?
Yeah, it certainly does. At almost the fundamental level, it increases their engagement in the classroom. So they are more interested in what they're learning. And because they're more interested in what they're learning, they also make an effort sometimes to even go outside of the classroom to learn certain new things, to go online, to Google up those kinds of information that they can then bring into the classroom. So the level of engagement has certainly increased, especially for students who are sometimes struggling with their learning. The long-term game. So think of education as a long game, if you like, because we're talking about a child going through an education system, a school system, from kindergarten all the way to when they exit out of formal education, university, post-secondary. That's about 15 years of their life in a formal education setting. So what we do as teachers and educators at the start all the way through, we have to prepare them and we have to almost believe that what we do for them for 15 years will make an impact as they grow older and they go into adulthood and into working life, etc. and all that. So the curriculum question is always, what do we have to teach them so that they can be ready in the future? And we see that shift as well in terms of curriculum. No longer, content is still important. The foundations are important, right? Literacy, numeracy. But we also see things like 21st century competencies coming to be important. The soft skills, how to communicate, how to speak to other people, right? How to manage your emotions are important now, emotional literacy and all that. And those are new curriculum content that's also coming into our classrooms, into our schools, etc. So we are preparing students for the future by equipping them with the tools, the knowledge, the skills, the competencies, in order for them to thrive in the future. And this is an impossible task because the future is always changing. We don't know what's going to happen.
That's true. I think moving on to maybe I think that's a nice segue to the second portion. If we were to continue, then we're looking at it from a student's perspective and their learning, right? But if we switch it up to perhaps the teacher's perspective, then based on the past 20 years and the research and the key points that you have noted previously, what would then be some of the factors that teachers will need to understand in order for them to have a successful teaching and learning environment in the classroom?
Teachers are increasingly equipped with a number of models of teaching, best practice models of teaching, and one of them is called the Singapore teaching practice. The Singapore teaching practice is one where the idea is to equip teachers with not just the philosophy of teaching, but the kinds of practices that are important for teachers to understand.
Dr. Kwek, so looking at, the factors that you've mentioned beforehand, especially knowing that now that recently Skills Future is also an avenue that teachers are able to tap on. And from whatever that you shared, it's quite evident that the research that you have conducted, or the team has conducted within the classrooms over the past 20 years, has not only helped students, but has also definitely helped with the provisions for teachers and the support that have been given in recent times. And we've always known this thing of make sure you listen to your teacher, make sure that, you don't get your teacher angry. The perception of listening to your teacher, a very off the cuff question then. How do you think that perception has changed in recent times?
I think most of us who have been through schooling, as a child, would remember back in the days when we were kids and we go into school, we were told to just shut up and listen to the teacher.
Yes.
And don't speak until you're told to, etc., and all that. I think that nature has changed substantially. The sage on the stage, the teacher who just does all the talking and all that, is not the case nowadays. We see students far more eager to speak up and are not afraid to raise their hand and say that, but Cher, I disagree with you, that kind of thing. So we are seeing a shift in the nature of the kinds of interactions that happens in the classroom. And teachers have to accept that kids are coming into classroom and they want to share and they want to speak up, and yes, they're there to learn, but they are also there to be given those opportunities to share some of the ideas that they bring from, not just from outside, from what they've learned, etc., but for the teacher to facilitate and help the students to make those kinds of connections and help the students to better understand the content knowledge that they have to learn, right? So I think that nature has begun to really change in the way teachers have to teach in the classroom, right? No longer the the lecture mode
Yeah.
where the teacher is just talking and talking and talking and refer to page this on the textbook, refer to page that. We now see different modalities coming in. We now have technology, so students have access to the student learning space. Some of the students in secondary schools now have personal learning devices, and they go home, they have access to those technologies as well, and they are able to bring those kinds of things that they've learned into the classroom. So things are changing. It's always continuously changing. I liken our school system to a huge oil tanker, right? That's always moving. And whenever we try to change parts of it, we always have to be mindful that it is still moving. So we cannot, overhaul this thing and make it into a speedboat. It's always an oil tanker that's moving slowly, and we're changing parts of it, but it is always moving in a particular direction. And that direction is towards the future. It is in a direction towards the 21st century learner for the students, and kind of trying to predict what kinds of competency, skills, knowledge and values that they will need to have as we move on in our changing the education system. Yeah.
I think that's a nice way to consolidate, our conversation thus far. And perhaps if there is anything more that a teacher or a student should take note of for the future when, perhaps those who would like to become a teacher in the future, or the ones who are perhaps young learners progressing on to becoming secondary school students, how do you think, or what do you think is the one thing or the two things that they will need to understand or they will need to remember in order to be in the classroom effectively?
Oh, there are multiple perspectives to that very interesting question. One is, you ask this question of if you're a student, right? What would it take one day for that student to one day become a teacher, right? And one of the things that I do in NIE, so I teach in NIE as well. And one of the things that I always ask students the first time I meet them as student teachers, right, is remember who your favorite teacher is. And why is it that a teacher is your favorite teacher? And many of them would say that it is not just this teacher is nice to them, right? So they are kind, they are nice, but importantly, those teachers that they remember are the ones that somehow activated their interest and joy in learning. That keeps them engaged in the classroom, and their lessons are stuff that they are always keen to come every day to meet a teacher, to learn new things. And I tell my student teachers, this is what you need to remember. Those kinds of skills that your favorite teachers are the ones that you need to help your own students learn one day in a way that will carry on through life, lah. And the students, in a way, right, it's almost like a osmosis. They absorb this and they become lifelong learners themselves as a result of that. So that's one perspective. The other thing is, as teachers, right, our future is fluid. It is increasingly unpredictable. The introduction of generative AI nowadays, it's amazing that nowadays you can create video just using prompts. People are now able to make almost like very short movies using just prompts, and it can generate that, and then you include the music and everything. You can now have AI generated singers, right? Songs which are fantastic. So we are at a stage where AI is becoming a very important part of our lives. And teachers have to deal with that. Teachers have to see how they can incorporate all these new tools that youth, children are going to be exposed to and are likely to be far more familiar with them than the adults are. How can teachers engage students to leverage those kinds of tools that they have at home and bring it into their learning? I think it's going to be one of the biggest challenges that they will face. I think they need to face that head on. They need to learn how to engage students in those kinds of technological advances and be mindful of the risks that are involved in it. So I think both of us are probably at a point in our lives when we were students that we have access to the calculator, right? So in school, my generation in the was the generation that had calculators introduced into our classrooms for the first time. So we learn in mathematics how to use the calculator to support our mathematics learning and all that kind of stuff. Now, if you ask me nowadays to do simple multiplication and addition of numbers and all that kind of stuff, I would say I need to bring out my calculator, my phone to calculate everything, right? I've lost a very important skill set because technology has replaced the need for me to learn those things. If I were to ask my mom, who never had exposure to calculators, she can do mental calculations off the top of her head. Right. Amazes me how
Yes, you have that mental all they
yeah, he do it decades, right? And now, and this I think is one of the implications of AI and new technologies.
I agree.
That there might be a consequence where some of the aspects of thinking will be taken over by the AI tools, and kids will increasingly rely on those tools at the expense of their own capacity to think in very critical and creative ways. I think that's something that some of the researchers around the world have started to notice. There is a recent study from MIT, which is showing that people who use ChatGPT, for example, that their brain connectivity of their neural networks in their brains is being affected by the use of ChatGPT as opposed to not using it at all. And one of the key lessons that they point out from their study, and this is an early study, is very preliminary but very important. One of the interesting findings they did was this was a study that involved university students writing essays.
I see. Okay.
And what they did was they actually used a group of students who have been writing essays without any ChatGPT help. And then they introduced ChatGPT later on to them. And they found that these students who relied not on ChatGPT at the start but later on are far more productive in their writing as compared to another group which just used ChatGPT all the way.
Oh, wait, true.
So timing of the introduction of AI into the pedagogy is actually I think, going to be an important thing for researchers to really understand how those new technologies are rewiring our brains in a way. Yeah. So I think that's going to be an important area.
I think that's a good point to kind of conclude our conversation. And I think perhaps maybe an interesting question to kind of conclude and tie everything up, since you've already mentioned, what should teachers and researchers even look out for. What would be some of the interesting topics that you would think you would want to do research on, given that generative AI is slowly seeping and integrating its way into both teaching aspect and learning aspect in every sort of academic level, be it in the formative school, be it in tertiary education. What will be some of the very interesting research topics that you think it will be interesting or be important to embark on to continue to understand how to have a sustained success in the classroom?
So this one of the new areas that we're exploring in our research center is this idea of the phrase "it takes a village to raise a child," right? The idea behind that phrase is a very powerful phrase. The idea behind it is that learning and teaching is not just a function of schools and schooling. That if you think about it, a child will go through probably 50% of the time in schools, and the learning that the other 50% happens is outside of schools, right? So we call it the differences between formal learning that happens in a formal classroom and non-formal learning, for example, learning that happens in co-curricular activities outside in various kinds of sports, for example, and then there's informal learning that happens outside of schools. We are trying to understand how those different kinds of learning in different contexts happens. That's one. The other thing that's also interesting for us is what does it mean that it takes a village to raise a child? Learning isn't just about what happens in the brain. Learning is also a function of the environment in which the child lives in. If the environment is not conducive, is not optimized for learning, then all the work that we do as teachers will not be as effective, right? And the question is, can we then leverage not just the school, but the peers that the child knows, the friends, families, for example, or even the community? How can all those different aspects come together to really optimize learning for the child? So there is a study done in Scotland called the Children's Neighbourhood Scotland. It's a project over there. And what they try to do is to look at learning in a very holistic sense. That you need to bring in, for example, people who are health workers to better understand the nutrition of the child, so that you know that, okay, the child is eating all this not so good stuff and it doesn't really help them in their learning. Or you bring in people who are interior designers who comes in and says that, okay, for children who stay in these kinds of flats, etc., you really want to try and design the environment so that there's one space there that, when the child goes into that space, it's in a space that they know they're going to get ready to do some serious learning, right? So bring in all these different stakeholders in to really help to optimize the learning environment for the child so that learning can occur almost naturally, right? I think a lot of work can be done in this area where we bring in the idea of the whole ecosystem, the whole community, in to help the child in doing the best in their learning.
I think today's conversation has given me a lot of food for thought. First of all, the fact that you made me remember who my favorite teacher was. It wasn't my math or my science teacher, unfortunately. But I think this conversation is very helpful. I think you will open up to the doors to a lot of other conversations for the future. So thank you so much, Dr. Kwek, for your time today. And I think I've learned a lot. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for inviting me here.
Thank you.